The national media covered at the Converge at the Utah State Prison to witness the execution of Gary Gilmore.
Have you ever wondered what goes through a killer's mind on the last day of their life? On January 17, 1977, Gary Gilmore woke up knowing it would be his last day alive. No appeals, no more delays, just the slow countdown to a rifle shot. But here's what made it different. He wanted to die. He fought for it, and he became the first person executed in the United States after a 10-year pause. But why? What led a man to beg the courts to kill him? And in those final 24 hours, what did he feel? Did he break down? Did he find peace? Or did he leave this world the same way he lived? This is the story of Gary Gilmore's final 24 hours, a man who chose to die and made America watch. Before Gary Gilmore became a name that would shape the future of American justice. He was just a boy, born into chaos, a name not even his own. Gary Mark Gilmore was born on December 4, 1940 as Fay Robert Kaufman. Why? Because his father was hiding from the law. Later, his mother quietly changed his name to Gary Mark Gilmore. But when Gary found his old birth certificate years later, he was shocked. He saw the name Fay Kaufman and started to believe maybe he didn't belong. Maybe he wasn't really his father's son. That moment never left him. He got angry. He pulled away from his mother. And from then on, things only got worse. His father, Frank Gilmore, was a con man and a heavy drinker. He'd been married before and had other children, but he didn't support any of them. They lived under false names. They kept running. Nothing ever felt steady or safe. Frank was strict, angry, and often violent. He beat his sons for small things, sometimes for no reason at all. He even hit his wife, Bessie, during arguments. And there were a lot of arguments. The home was loud, tense, and full of shouting. Frank would mock Bessie's Mormon faith. She would scream back, threatening to kill him. It was a family held together by fear and resentment. However, Gary was smart, really smart. He had a high IQ, did well on tests, and could draw beautifully. But none of that mattered. He dropped out of school in 9th grade and ran away from home. He and a friend traveled to Texas, living rough with no plan. When he came back months later, something in him had changed. He was angry. He was restless. And he no longer trusted anyone, and no one, not even his own family, could stop what was coming next. By the time Gary Gilmore was just 14, the path ahead of him had already started to turn dark. He and a group of friends started stealing cars, not for survival, but for the thrill. He got caught. The court let him go with a warning, but only 2 weeks later, he was back, arrested again for stealing another car. This time, the system decided to act. He was sent to McLaren Reform School for Boys, a correctional facility in Oregon. It was the beginning of a life in and out of institutions. When he got out, it didn't take long before he was arrested again for the same crime. Another stolen car. Another sentence. This time, he was sent to Oregon State Correctional Institution. The punishments didn't stop him. If anything, they hardened him. In 1961, tragedy struck. Gary's father, Frank, was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. Gary was sitting in a Portland jail, locked up for driving without a license, when a guard came to tell him the news. "Your father's dead." Even after all the abuse, those words shattered him. He tried to take his own life, slashing his wrists in a cell filled with despair. From that moment on, Gary seemed to unravel. He drank more, fought more, got arrested more. By 1964, he was a repeat offender, arrested for assault and armed robbery. The courts had had enough. They labeled him a habitual criminal and sentenced him to 15 years in prison. He was sent to the Oregon State Penitentiary, where a prison psychiatrist diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder mixed with psychotic breakdowns that came and went. Still, Gary kept finding ways to slip through the cracks. In 1972, he was granted conditional release. The plan was simple: live in a halfway house, and go to art school. But Gary never registered for classes. Within weeks, he was arrested again for armed robbery. His violent behavior inside prison made him a problem. So in 1975, he was transferred to Marion, a maximum security federal prison in Illinois. But what came next would mark the point of no return. In April of 1976, Gary was given another chance. He was paroled again. This time sent to Provo, Utah, to live with his cousin Brenda Nicole. She believed in him. She gave him a roof. She helped him get work, first at a shoe repair shop, then at an insulation company. For a brief moment, things seemed like they might turn around, but the same demons were still with him. He started drinking again, stealing again, fighting again. And then Gary had a relationship with Nicole Barrett, a 19-year-old woman with 2 children. She had already been married twice. Their relationship was intense, volatile, and quickly spiraled into chaos. Gary was now 35 years old, and within weeks he would kill. July 19, 1976. Gary walked into a gas station in Orem, Utah. The clerk's name was Max Jensen. He was a young husband, a student at Brigham Young University. Max followed every order. He handed over the money. He didn't resist. But Gary made him lie face down on the floor and shot him in the head. The next night, July 20th, it happened again. Gary entered a motel office in Provo. The manager, Benny Bushnell, was another young student, another father. Again, no resistance. Again, Gary gave the same command: lie down. Then he pulled the trigger. 2 nights, 2 murders, 2 young men gone, each leaving behind a wife and infant child. But Gary made a mistake. As he tried to hide the murder weapon, he accidentally shot himself in the hand. That's how blood poured from the wound. And that blood led police straight to him. A mechanic who had seen Gary hide the gun in a bush recognized him. He noticed the injury. He heard about the shooting on a police scanner, and he called it in. When Gary called his cousin Brenda, asking for bandages and painkillers, she turned him in. Police stopped him just as he was trying to leave Provo. He didn't run. He gave up. Gary's trial began October 5, 1976, at the courthouse in Provo. It lasted just 2 days. A motel guest took the stand and said he saw Gary rob Benny Bushnell. He saw him shoot him after taking the money. An FBI expert matched bullets from both murders to Gary's pistol. A trail of blood led from the crime scene to the very bush where he had hidden the gun. Gary's lawyers didn't argue. They didn't call a single witness in his defense. Gary wanted to testify, maybe even argue insanity. But 4 separate psychiatrists had already said it. He knew what he was doing. He just didn't care. In court, Gary's attorneys gave a half-hearted closing. They asked for second-degree murder, or even an acquittal. But the evidence was overwhelming. On October 7th, the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder. That same day, they chose the death penalty. At a Board of Pardons hearing, he said, "They always want to get in on the act. This is my life, and this is my death. It's been sanctioned by the courts, and I accept that." When asked how he wanted to die, by hanging or firing squad, Gary chose the latter. "I'd prefer to be shot." The first execution date was set for November 15th, but was delayed. The final one came on January 17, 1977. While on death row, Gary tried to kill himself twice. Once after his first execution was paused, and again 1 month later. Now the clock was ticking. January 16, 1997, morning. The first light of morning filtered into the Utah State Prison in Draper. A bitter cold hung in the air, just a few degrees above freezing. Guards had been rotating in and out all night, keeping watch over inmate number 80598, a man who had executed 2 innocent strangers without hesitation and who now sat awaiting his own end. Gary Gilmore had slept restlessly. When a guard checked on him shortly after 5 a.m., he was already awake, sitting upright on the edge of his cot, fully dressed in a white prison-issue shirt and blue pants. His boots were laced. He had made his bed. He looked tired, hollowed out, but strangely composed. The guards didn't speak much. They had been instructed to follow protocol, to treat him like any other prisoner. But there was no mistaking it. This was different. He took a sip of the coffee. He looked at the rest of it like it was meaningless. And to him it was. Food no longer had value. The month before, he had gone on a 25-day hunger strike. Not to make a statement to the world, but out of pure emotional despair. That was when his execution had been delayed, and he had been forcibly separated from the only person he still deeply cared about, his girlfriend, Nicole Barrett. Why? Because he and Nicole Barrett had made a suicide pact. She had smuggled sedatives into the prison during a visit. He swallowed his. So did she. Both survived. But that act changed everything. From that day forward, all contact between them was cut off. In his cell, he had written her letter after letter, some filled with longing, others with rage, desperation, or heartbreak. He poured his soul onto the page, sometimes begging her to wait for him, other times saying goodbye. But now, she wasn't writing back. Nicole had been hospitalized, and in these final hours, Gary knew that the woman he had once hoped to die for wouldn't be with him when the end came. By the afternoon, the weight in the air had only thickened. Outside Utah State Prison, activists from the American Civil Liberties Union were still filing urgent motions. Inside, Gary Gilmore could feel it, the legal machine trying to wrench the narrative from his hands. But Gary didn't want a miracle. He didn't want a stay of execution. What he wanted was something no judge could fully understand: control. As the hours passed, a prison official informed him of the ACLU's latest filing. Gary's response was swift and scathing. He barked at the court through a public statement, condemning what he called a bunch of moral cowards. To him, these lawyers weren't saving his life. They were stealing his agency. He also felt betrayed by his own mother. Bessie Gilmore, who had raised him through years of chaos and hardship, had tried to save him in court, filing for a stay without his blessing. She had done it out of love. But Gary saw it as another chain being wrapped around his will. The prison warden kept a close watch. A final suicide attempt was always possible. But this afternoon, Gary made no such move. Occasionally, he would get up, walk around the cell, light a cigarette, and mutter to himself. As darkness fell over Utah State Prison, the man scheduled to die in the morning was not begging for mercy. He was hosting what felt like a farewell gathering. Gary Gilmore had been given sedatives. His mind, long turbulent, was now clouded in a chemical calm. Still, his eyes were sharp, his voice steady. Then he was served a last meal of steak, potatoes, milk, and coffee. He consumed only the milk and coffee. Few minutes later, family and a few close visitors arrived at the prison mess hall. Among them was his uncle, Vern D'Amico, who would later admit on national television what he had smuggled in, a small bottle of whiskey. Gary drank it down in one go. There would be no prison rules tonight. To everyone's surprise, his spirits were high. He smiled. He joked. The man who had once been labeled a violent menace now sat among loved ones, soaking in his final hours with strange peace. Then the phone rang. It was Johnny Cash, Gary's favorite singer. The voice on the line didn't belong to a lawyer, a judge, or a journalist. It was the deep, steady voice of a man who understood sorrow. Johnny sang, and Gary tried to sing along, his voice cracking but determined. For a brief moment, the prison walls fell away. All that remained was a dying man and a song he loved. Afterward, Gary asked for a tape recorder. He wanted to send a message to Nicole. He poured his final thoughts into that cassette, and somewhere in that quiet recording, he made one last chilling request. He asked her to kill herself for him. The night wore on. The sedatives took hold. The guests began to leave. There were no speeches, no breakdowns, only the weight of goodbye. It was still dark when Gary Mark Gilmore woke up on the last morning of his life. At exactly 7:53 a.m., guards entered his cell in the maximum security wing of Utah State Prison. Gilmore, calm and clear-eyed, didn't resist. He stood, walked, and boarded a van for the short half-mile ride to the execution area. It is a small cinder-block building that looked more like a tool shed than a place of death. He was surrounded by men who had watched him for months. Now, their job was to carry out his final request. Outside, the temperature was in the low 20s. In a separate room nearby, nearly 60 protesters stood silently in the cold, holding candles. Similar vigils were happening all over the country. Inside, the witnesses began to arrive. Warden Sam Smith, prison officials, the state medical examiner, and 4 people Gary had personally chosen to be there. Vern D'Amico, his loyal uncle. Larry Schiller, a film producer who had followed Gary's case. Ronald Stanger and Robert Moody, his attorneys. There was meant to be a 5th, Nicole Barrett. But she wasn't there. The witnesses entered the small chamber where the execution chair stood waiting. Gary was already there, seated and strapped down with nylon restraints, wrists, legs, chest. He exchanged a few quiet words with each of them. Cotton plugs were offered for their ears. Then the warden stepped forward and read aloud the death warrant. Gary looked calm, still. At one point, he glanced toward the screen that concealed the firing squad, perhaps hoping to see Nicole one last time, but the screen stayed still. When asked if he had any final words, Gilmore spoke without hesitation. "Let's do it." They were simple words, direct, fearless, final. Then Father Thomas Mearsman, a Catholic priest, stepped forward to deliver last rites. As he began, Gary replied softly, "The Lord be with you." The priest responded, "And with your spirit." After that, a white target was pinned over Gary's heart. It was a small circle stitched onto a black t-shirt. At 8:05 a.m., 5 marksmen stood behind the wall, armed with Winchester Model 94 rifles, each loaded with .30-30 caliber rounds. 4 rifles had live bullets. One carried a blank, so no one would know who fired the fatal shot. The countdown ended. A sudden deafening crack echoed through the chamber as the rifles fired in unison. Gary's head turned slightly to the left. His fingers twitched. Blood slowly began to spread beneath the black shirt, soaking into the white prison pants and dripping to the floor. 20 seconds passed. Then silence. The prison doctor stepped forward, checked for breath, felt for a pulse. There was none, and at 8:07 a.m. he was dead. Soon after, Ken Schulson, an official with the Utah Department of Corrections, emerged to inform the press. The order of the 4th Judicial Circuit has been carried out. Inside, the room emptied. The witnesses stepped out into the cold. The protesters lowered their candles. In accordance with Gary's wishes, his organs were donated. By that afternoon, 2 blind patients had received his corneas. His body was sent for autopsy, then cremated. The next day, January 18th, his ashes were scattered from a small plain above Spanish Fork, Utah, the same place where he had once roamed as a troubled young man. And just like that, it was over. To some, he was a killer who got what he deserved. To others, he was a disturbed man who should have been helped, not shot. His story still raises uncomfortable questions. Should a person have the right to choose death? Did the system serve justice or surrender to it? What do you guys think? Don't forget to drop a comment about it. We want to hear from you. Also, did we miss anything? Or should we cover another case like this one? Mention it down below. Till then, bye.